We had a break last Tuesday, but we are happy to continue with our series now. As most of you know, that this is a series in which, following the 23 series on the GCM objectives that we had beginning of September last year, and then the International Migrants Day, and some of us in civil society have been looking at some of the burning important issues that have not yet been fully explored, or we have not yet looked at these issues in depth, and the pandemic allows us a good time to have a reset and thinking through some of these issues once again, even as we look at global governance of migration. And on the sidelines, the regional reviews are happening on the Global Compact, and with an upcoming review of the international community on the Global Compact, we thought it would be good to look at some of these burning issues, or priority issues as we call them, and see how we want to bring to the table a more critical, constructive discussion as we move along. So today we will look at irregular migration and regular pathways. Just to remind everyone that, again, this is meant to build, we are trying to build a momentum in preparation for the International Migration Review Forum, but it is also a space for us to listen to some of these discourses and take them to other spaces that are open and opening for us at regional, national, and international level, so that we can bring to those tables this kind of perspective from the ground. And as we continue to mobilize around this, we will give you updates on that as we move along. The one update that was given at the beginning of this is the web page that we have put up. It's called People's Migration Challenge, which focuses on the 5 priority issues of this particular series that we are doing. And we ask you to have a look at that and contribute to that website, Facebook, and Twitter feed as much as you can, just to be able to help us continue to build this momentum that we are trying on. We will also come back on each of these series. So on today's series, we will come back 8 weeks from now in a different format. So keep an eye out for that in terms of what would be the preparation for that. For those who are not listening in English, there are 3 other languages that you can pick up on. If there's an interpretation icon there. If you click on it, you will see that this is being done in English, Spanish, French, and Arabic. You might choose the language that you are most comfortable with, and we thank the interpreters for helping us out in this. Once again, the chat box is open for you to post questions, except for English. Unfortunately, I do not understand any of the other languages or read them, but I have colleagues who will point it out to me. And I ask also the co-organizers to point out questions that might appear in any of the other languages. And they are in contact with me through WhatsApp. So I should be able to get some of those questions or comments that are there that we can take up in the limited time in this webinar today. So let us start. And just to remind the panelists, this is meant to be highly interactive. And so I would like the panelists to keep that in mind, that we speak in conversation style, but in limited time frames, so that we can have a back and forth between us, the panelists, and the people that are in the platform as well. So let me then start with irregular migration and regular pathways. And I will start with Patrick Taran. Many of you know Patrick Taran from before, and if you don't know, I have too big a CV of his to actually be able to share in this series, so I will not do that. All I will say is I know Patrick for a very long time, from his days in Migrant Rights International, then his days in the ILO, now in Global Migration Policy Associates, and then his work that he has done at the regional level. Patrick is well known at the policy level, well known at the activist and academia level, a man who has helped many of us think through some of the most difficult policy issues on migration. He always brings a very critical, constructive perspective to what we think, and very often a very holistic perspective in how we must look at issues as well. So it's always good to have his insights as we move forward. And so, Patrick, let me start with you then. As we, when we were putting these terms together, even as organizers, we struggled with it, irregular migration and regular pathways. And even as we talk about it today, we know that even as we talk about it, there are limitations to it that we have kind of aligned ourselves towards, even largely because of the policy engagement of where it is at the global level now. And we know even in the Global Compact, for example, it did fall short of some of our expectations in terms of irregular migration. In terms of regular pathways, this question has come up over and over again. And in fact, in the 23 webinar series, we were looking at this as a keystone objective that was important to look at all the other objectives from this kind of perspective. And now following the pandemic, it is becoming a very important objective to look at as well. So even with its limitations. So let me just ask you then, Patrick, in terms of mobility, when you look at mobility as a whole, and now when we look at mobility in the post-COVID world kind of thing, before and after kind of thing, how have we framed mobility in a restricted way when we talk about, at least in policy discourse today, on irregular migration and regular pathways? Patrick, the platform is yours. You will have to unmute yourself, Patrick. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, William, for that generous introduction, and also for allowing me perhaps to indeed throw out a couple of challenges to start off this discussion today. And I think you led me right to a point I'd like to make, or 2 points I'd like to make. And that is essentially that the terminology, the dominant terminology, doesn't describe either what's going on or what we need to focus on to make sure that migration is just rights-based and provides for people's welfare wherever they are and wherever their families are. And I'd like to say, first of all, the whole question of pathways doesn't quite get the fact that in many regions of the world today, 50 to 80% of the migration moves within free movement areas where people have rights, not only in terms of human rights, but where in those free movement systems, people have the right to move from one country to another within the regional economic community, where they have a right to residence in another country, and where they have a right to establish themselves either in employment or business where they go. And if we look at, for example, the economic community of West African states, that's 80% of the migration originating in ECOWAS countries goes to other West African countries. Figures used to be, in fact, similar for the European Union, but with aging population and declining workforces, the European Union finds it's necessary to, in fact, draw people from outside, from third countries, simply because there isn't enough people circulating within the European Union under free movement to provide for the needs for labor and skills in other member countries of that area. And you can look at a number of other regions: East Africa Community, Mercosur in South America, Caribbean Community, the Eurasian Economic Community of former Soviet states and the Russian Federation, and so on. The point I want to underline is when we talk about pathways, pathways somehow limits, I think, the discussion to looking at bilateral arrangements, when really the challenge we have today is, because of protectionist pressures, because of a security approach, even some of those free circulation regimes are under pressure. And we saw that in the European Union when COVID broke out. And we also saw an immediate reaction from the European Parliament that said, don't close borders within the European Union. It's going to strangle our agricultural production. It's going to strangle our economic activity. And in fact, even when the borders were closed, here where 100,000 people go every day from neighboring France into Geneva to work, if you had any basis to go to Geneva, you weren't even stopped. You went right across the so-called closed border. But it's just to give a notion on that we're in a big challenge. And I'll just quickly mention, and maybe we can come back later, the whole question of irregular migration. Well, in fact, according even to Europol estimates in Europe, 80 to 90% of all migration today, of the movement, happens through regular channels. That is to say, either in free movement regimes, people have visas, they have work permits or whatever. And where there is irregularity, is the fact that it's very easy to be pushed out of status when a person arrives in a new country. Your job ties you to a residence permit. If you lose your job, get fired, or the job disappears, you lose the residence permit, you become irregular. And I can go on, so on and so forth. But again, the challenge isn't irregular migration. The challenge is the protection of people who fall into irregular status in countries of destination of employment. And the challenge then is not only protection, but regularization. In other words, making sure that people can get, be, and remain in some kind of regular status that will enhance the protection they have under the rights that should be applied to everyone, and so on. I'll leave it at that. I think I just wanted to kind of push that as starting us off in what I hope is a dynamic discussion, looking at the great wealth of knowledge and experience in my co-panelists today.
Thanks. Thank you, Patrick, for that. And I like how you started off by saying that there were free movement regimes. And but now these are under pressure, largely because of this kind of protectionist, securitized kind of agenda, which is creeping in. And when this agenda creeps in, it does infringe on the rights of mobility, and it then goes on into even the question of regular migration. So one would then ask, just to follow up then, if regular migration, and this was one of the big discussions in the GCM as well, when they were talking about irregular migration, you could see a polarization of the discourse in the sense of the two different camps, the countries of destination, countries of origin, and there was a kind of almost like a trade-off, a transactional approach when it comes to looking at irregular migration and regular pathways. Now, from a policy perspective, what would be your, what would you think we need to be doing? Is this a transactional approach that needs to be taken, or is there another approach that can be dealt with, that can be used to move forward?
William, I'd actually say it's a question of a reconceptualization approach and a going back to basic values, and also looking at the real economic interests of the very economic and social interests of the various partners, both at the level of governments and countries, but also at the level of the peoples concerned. The whole point of free movement, and the reason it is in effect in so many communities of countries, is it's an essential part of building an integrated and developing economy that can no longer be solely based in national context, and particularly in small national countries that have no basis in terms of resource, extent of labor power and skills, or in the size of markets to be able to compete effectively nationally and internationally with large spaces that can achieve economies of scale and so on. Without going further in that direction, the other direction I want to go in is the difficulty, I think, with policy directions, particularly on migration, is that a lot depends on who's sitting at the table. And in my impression, in many of the international migration debates I've been at, dialogues, so to speak, the people at the table from many of the countries come from the control side of governments, the interior ministries, the police forces, even the military. And, you know, I can think of a GFMD where I sat down to the representative of one Pacific country, and he happened to be the head of migration of the country. He also happened to be a colonel who had been part of the coup that had overthrown the democratically elected government in that country, relatively previous to that particular event. That was the Mexico GFMD, by the way. And it just listening to that, listening to the debate and seeing who's present, if you can see who they are, and often you can kind of read between the lines who they are. The problem is you have people around the table, like it would be, if I want to be provocative, I'd say it's like the police sitting around talking to each other about how we're going to deal with police violence. Well, the thing is, you have to have a number of other people around. And when you're talking about migration, you're talking essentially about movement of people who are working, people who are contributing, people who are moving in fact, to engage in economic activity elsewhere, and in many cases, moving to meet labor and skills deficits or needs in the other countries they go to. And in many cases, that's because, to give a good example, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania were part of an East African colonial heritage by the UK, but when they became independent, they were part of an integrated whole where if you wanted to go to school in engineering, you went to Tanzania. If you wanted to go to school in law, you went to school in Kampala, Uganda. If you wanted to go to school in medicine or something like that, it was Nairobi, Kenya. And even the post offices of the three countries were one integrated unit because that was the only way it was going to work. And if you were going to practice law, you got your degree maybe in Kampala, but you might be equally expected to bring that experience to Kenya or Tanzania. That's just kind of a practical example. But the point I'm saying is mobility today has a very strong root in the development of our whole economic and political systems, and the need for mobility is growing. But there are many interests in controlling that mobility so that you can control, make it difficult for people to organize, to respect their rights. So why not make it easy for people to fall into irregular situations and set up global arrangements that leave it up to individual countries to decide what they're actually going to do, and not say that they're necessarily bound to specific standards of everyone is covered by international labor standards and everyone is covered by the basic human rights, both in the general human rights instruments and specifically in the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of their Families.
Thanks, Patrick, for that. So then, Patrick, you do speak about like a reconceptualizing approach. You talk about an integrated development. We've got to have a perspective of integrated development, developing economies, and at the end of the day, you're saying it comes to who's sitting at the table. Michelle, I'll come to you now because I know you've spent, I don't know how many years trying to do this reconceptualizing approach in just trying to get people to use the right term. You know, when irregular migration, when people say illegal to migrants kind of thing. And the years you've spent just trying to get people to say, use the right term kind of thing. So when Patrick talks about reconceptualizing and how the system is kind of set up kind of thing, that this discourse that does not seem to then therefore move forward. And looking at it in the GCM as well, we know that we've had some challenges there. So in your perspective then, what would be, looking at it now where within, let us say, the region of Europe, what would be one or two of the big issues that we need to look at in terms of reconceptualizing and moving forward? What would you say are the key ideas there? Michelle.
Yes, thank you, William, and thanks, Patrick, for that overview. Maybe I can just briefly share with you how we see irregular migration within the EU, kind of to set the scene for also understanding then how we could also answer this question. We've actually had a common EU migration and asylum policy since 1999. So we've had it in place for 2 decades. And it's interesting because if you look at it was from the Tampere, Finland Council conclusions. And if you look at the early years from 1999 and the couple of years, maybe even a decade afterwards, the EU actually used the language combating illegal migration. So the language itself has changed now. Now they talk about preventing irregular migration. But we still see, I think, this predominance on return, deportation. And the other point that I would like to make is almost a taboo around regularization. But first, briefly on return and deportation. It's basically in this past 22-year period, it's mainly just been re-emphasized each time there's a new policy proposal or new legislative proposal or strengthening the agency. So the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, which is called Frontex, has had increased powers, increased budgets. Just to give some numbers and some examples. So from the period from 2007 until 2019, so a 12-year period, Frontex helped EU member states deport over 50,000 people to places like Afghanistan and Iraq and other places. But now with the new proposals, Frontex could deport 50,000 people per year from 2024 onwards. So whereas that was 50,000 people over a 12-year period, now it could be almost 50,000 people per year. This could be because its budget's increasing. It was 6 million euros in 2005, and last year in 2020 was 460 millions euros. They would also hire 10,000 staff by 2027. It's expected by 2027, Frontex will have received 5.6 billion euros. But there is some pushback. The European Parliament has recently set up a Frontex scrutiny group because there have been incidents of pushbacks involving Frontex. So the Parliament is looking into them, and the Parliament is looking at how it's managing its agency. So the Parliament has also said that they will postpone a vote on Frontex's budget to the fall of this year because they're waiting for a report from that group. But we see, like, Frontex is one element of it. There's other elements. The Commission has proposed that there would be a new return coordinator. There would be a new EU high-level network on return. There'd be a new Frontex Deputy Executive Director on return. And this is all part of the new Pact on Migration and Asylum, which was released last year in September. I think what's interesting for us to consider is that in terms of the Global Compact on Migration negotiations, the EU as a body was leading them. And at the end, there's 18 out of 27 EU member states who've adopted the GCM. So we think that it should be advisable that any new policy proposal or legislative proposal that comes from the EU level should reflect that 2/3 of the member states have adopted the GCM. And we don't see that as the case with the new pact. So the new pact on migration has 5 legislative proposals and 4 recommendations. And in many of these proposals, they would reduce safeguards for people at borders. They'd set unrealistic timeframes to have fair procedures. They would increase detention. It would increase detention also for children. All of these things are commitments that 2/3 of EU member states have adopted in the pact to say that they won't do. They won't detain more children. They won't increase detention. They'll work towards alternatives. We don't really see this happening with the pact. So I think that one of the key issues, and also the issue of return, in 2018, in September, the EU proposed that the key legislative piece on return, which is the Returns Directive, it should be revised. Why would it have to be revised? It had been in place already for 10 years because the return rate was too low. So the Commission made a proposal to revise it. It did not get approved in the last legislative term. Now the European Parliament is currently reviewing it, as well as the member states. There are 700 plus amendments to this legislative proposal. But also, just to say, one of these key issues that we face within this geographical location, or I think it's also in many, but is just this predominance on return, predominance on, in a sense, preventing irregular migration by facilitating return. I also have some kind of points also on how the EU sees regular pathways, like the opposite of that. If you'd like, I can say that also briefly. So in the sense, this is where we see it's much more lacking. It's not as developed. There are many different instruments that the EU has to regulate regular pathways. So for example, we have the Blue Card Directive for highly skilled workers. There's a single permit directive it's like a framework directive or a horizontal directive, but it doesn't really cover a true needs-based approach to migrant workers. There's a seasonal workers directive, which mainly covers agriculture or temporary work. There's an intercorporate transferee directive, there's a student and researchers directive, there's a family reunification directive. So there's a lot of instruments, and I would say that they've all been in the past 10 years or so, but they're still not really meeting the needs on the ground. What was interesting is each one of them has its own challenges. One of the submissions that was made to the UNICEF, or the European Regional Review Forum for the Global Compact last year in November, was from the Child Rights in the Global Compact. And this submission said that on family reunification, that there are too many administrative barriers for children to reunite with their parents. parents to reunite with their children. It's too complicated, it's too expensive to provide information or proof that you're actually a member of someone's family. For example, you have to take a DNA test. There's too high income requirements, too short deadlines. So it often means that even though we have this directive at the EU level, we have this legislation, in practice, it's very hard to actually achieve family reunification. So there's other issues as well. There's a new EU action plan against racism from September of last year. And this really might be a step forward to looking at what are the structural problems also with some of the migration policy proposals. But we still have to see how much it will really work together with migration policy. And just as an example, if you look at some of the data, Eurostat, which is the statistics division of the EU, had data from 2018 that said that only 5% of all first-time permits that were issued for remunerated activities, so that's work permits and researchers, were given to nationals of 55 countries in Africa. So in 2018, of all those permits for work, 5% were given to African nationals. And then, you know, Europeans, North Americans, Latin Americans were kind of a combination of all the rest. But it's also kind of to examine how much would this also fall under the anti-racism action plan. So I think that there are key issues that we have to look at. I also have some points on regularization, but maybe let me limit it to this right now, because I think you might have some follow-up questions.
Yes, Michelle, I mean, and thanks for that. That's a whole lot of information that you gave us, and largely an information of a whole region going in the wrong direction that the compact was aiming to go into. And so that becomes a challenge in itself as we think of the International Review Forum coming up as well. So this whole focus, I'm wondering, look, and economists have talked about this, demographers have talked about this, that Europe's big issue of demography would mean in certain ways that there would be a need for, you know, there has to be some openness for opening up more, Europe opening up more, allowing more people to come in. And surely there should be some thinking along those lines, even as we face new challenges with, for example, climate change and things like that. And we've seen other parts of the world already grappling with some of that. So in the Pacific, for example, you see countries being more open to recognize that climate change would be one of the drivers of migration and things like that. But when we listen to you to speak about it in the European context, it's so much of this legislation, policies, frameworks, you know, this kind of bureaucracy kicking in, which actually does not respond to what is the challenge that it needs to be responding to. So it's like a almost a bureaucracy delinking itself from reality. And so in that sense, then, how should at least civil society organizations, and as we prepare and things like that for the IMRF or international spaces, because Europe does play the power game as well with countries of origin. And you have said that yourself in giving one example of this 5% of regularizations kind of thing for people from Africa. So how should we as organizations be looking at engaging with this moving forward, particularly on issues like irregular migration? Michelle.
Yes, thanks. Actually, that 5%, that thing that I quoted, that was actually for first-time permits. It wasn't for regularization, but it was European countries giving these permits, and then they have the origin country from where the workers or the researchers are coming from. I think our approach within PICUM at looking at irregular migration is to really unpack it into different thematic areas that most concern the living, the working conditions of undocumented migrants, and in a sense, basically looking at like a cohesive human rights approach. And we've been working for 20 years now within the European context. And I think that where we've seen both at the EU level and both at the national level, where there have been the most openings, are usually actually not necessarily in migration policy per se, but in other policy areas. Or it's in migration policy, but with unpacking it from a different approach. And I could maybe give some examples, because I think it's interesting for us to think, where does this resonate with other geographical contexts? Where is it maybe slightly different? So for example, on healthcare, healthcare is a national level competence in the EU. So that means there's 27 member states of the EU. So that means there's 27 different healthcare systems. That means that if you're looking at undocumented migrants' entitlements or their access by law, you have to look at 27 different systems. So we've seen some cases where this is actually somewhat positive. So France, for example, has legislation that's almost 25 years old that enables undocumented migrants access to healthcare. It's relatively broad. There's obviously many challenges to realizing it in practice, but almost every year this law is challenged. It's challenged by the far right. And at the same time, it still remains standing, mainly because there's very dedicated people within the health ministry. There's very broad coalitions of civil society and health experts that work together to make sure the law remains. In Sweden, the law changed in 2013 to enable a broader access for healthcare for undocumented. But that took almost 15 years for civil society to achieve. And they did it not only by having this huge coalition of almost 80 organizations, including the major trade unions of Sweden, but also having a special rapporteur on health from the UN make a country visit to Sweden, and a parliamentary inquiry. So I think those are two examples where you can really see broad support for broad and sustained support. What's also interesting now that we're in the COVID reality is that there's 7 countries in Europe, the UK is actually one of them, who've made specific reference in how they're going to roll out the COVID vaccine, that they will include undocumented migrants. So it's Belgium, France, Ireland, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, and the UK. So it means that, you know, people have to be, those policies have to be inclusive. But we see it in other areas as well. So victims of crime, for example, there's EU legislation from 2012 on the Victims of Crime Directive. There's a new strategy from last year on this that says specifically that undocumented migrants can be targeted because they're undocumented. So the new strategy has to recognize this and have a focused approach. Alternatives to detention. Even though I just kind of described this broad leitmotif of return from the European Commission, basically, they are also recognizing that in order to not fully have a full migration management approach, you can also look at putting people in community-based settings. So they're also looking at alternatives to detention. And I would say another area is legal challenges. I know in the Asian context, this is also something that you're very strong in. In Europe, this is extremely strong in other contexts as well. This is how civil society also really mobilizes, is to challenge all of this by law. So we've seen networks of lawyers in different themes, for example, around people who are providing humanitarian assistance to undocumented migrants, helping them get food, helping them, transporting them in their car in a mountainous region, otherwise they die of frostbite, saving them from the water if they're drowning. There have been cases and cases of people who have been penalized or arrested because of doing that. So we've seen lawyers mobilize around that. And the last one that I wanted to give was cities. Within the European context, this is an issue. The mobilizing of cities around undocumented migrants' human rights has been especially pronounced in recent years through the involvement of researchers. There's the City Initiative on Irregular Migrants is coordinated by Compass at the University of Oxford. They've produced guidance, so they're really mobilizing cities and regional governments. We have 2 examples of Spanish regional autonomous governments who've given the similar type of minimum income to undocumented during the COVID pandemic. So they're all different examples, but there's many, many different ways to challenge the framing, I think, of irregular migration.
Thanks. No, thanks for that, Michelle, and thanks for pointing out how when I mean, when you first pose what the problem is, I like how in the examples that you have given now, you showed how the resistance, or at least the way it is challenged, is by different stakeholders in areas of competence coming together and fighting the system or pushing back against what is being constructed, kind of thing. And I think those are some useful ideas for us, even as civil society, to deliberate on and to see what to develop partnerships and alliances with, kind of with some of these initiatives. So thank you for that. And then for those, I'm sorry I didn't introduce you, Michelle, but I'll do that now. For those who don't know Michelle, she is the executive director. This was an assumption that the whole world knows Michelle, but Michelle is the executive director of PICUM, and Michelle has been very key in deconstructing this whole discourse on irregular migration for many of us in many different spaces. She has been with Migrant Rights International. She is currently now with the Global Compact Global Coalition on Migration, and she has done a lot of advocacy work and education work, I must say, with the European Commission in getting their own perspectives correct. So thank you, Michelle, for being with us today to share that with us. And let me then move on to Oscar. And Oscar Chacon is with Alianza Americas. And Oscar has again been a figure that has been at the forefront of many of these debates at the international level and how it is framed. And I like Oscar because he gives a very good framing of how we should be looking at these issues. And Oscar, Michelle talked about one of the ways to show what the issue is that PICUM strategy is by living and working conditions of undocumented migrants. That is one of the ways that is PICUM strategy. And we know international media over the last 4 years, 5 years, this has been a burning issue because of the situation that you have in the Americas, kind of thing. And if you open CNN on any given day, or within the week, at least 3 or 4 episodes of CNN in the news will carry this issue. As you look at this issue and as you talk to policymakers in the region, in the Americas, what do you think the international community, or what do you think in your own context is not happening from a big, large framework kind of picture? And then what should we be doing from an action-oriented perspective? Oscar, the platform is yours.
Thank you very much, William. And first of all, it's a pleasure to be in such great company. It's good to see the names and faces of so many people with whom I cross paths in different global events. Let me build upon what both Patrick and Michelle have said and just add a couple of perspectives. And let me also make it clear, my comments come primarily from my familiarity, my experience in what I basically call the Mesoamerican Corridor, which is basically the corridor that links primarily Central American countries, Mexico, and the United States of America. And I say that because the Americas is a large chunk of land and there are multiple realities within this continent. And I just want to make clear that my comments come primarily from my experience, as I said, in the corridor linking the countries I already mentioned. Let me add, but first of all, I agree, with most of what both Patrick and Michelle said. But let me say that I believe that there are 2 issues that, at least from our perspective in this corridor, are very important in as far as why the debate has taken place in the way it has. Both the political debate, but also the public debate on these issues. And the first question I want to raise is white supremacy, racism, as we know it in the US. The bottom line is, beginning back in the 1970s, as the nature of who was seeking to settle in the US began to change in a way in which Mexicans, Central American, Caribbean nationalities became the dominant groups wanting to settle in the US, the debate shifted very strongly to essentially demonize these people, and racial prejudice has been very much at the heart of it. And essentially the narrative that has dominated both the public and the policy debate has been, to put it in one word, toxic. It basically paints these new immigrants, these new migrants, as some sort of cancer, that has to be dealt with, has to be put an end to. And that mentality has filtered everything that we have done by way of policy. So the US has been a champion in as far as detaining people, in as far as militarizing borders, in as far as sending people back by the millions, not tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, but by the millions, over the past 15, 25 years. And remember that during the Obama presidency is when we saw the highest numbers of people being actually sent back, particularly to Mexico, but certainly the other countries as well. So that's one factor that I don't want to go this morning without mentioning, because I think it's very, very important to understand that us, people of color, have been basically the protagonist in terms of who moves around the world, not only in terms of irregular migration, but also just people moving. The debate about us has become very strongly permeated by this notion that we are a threat. So that's one aspect that I want to highlight. The second aspect that I want to highlight is that, ironically, the drive for people, especially people from Africa, Asia, and in our case, Latin American countries, has become so intense. This same set of events has taken place at the same time that, from an economic policy point of view, we have welcomed more and more freedom, for great corporations to move anywhere they want, for rich people to invest without any restrictions and without any regulations wherever they want. But at the same time, we have seen the rights of individuals essentially curtailed. And this is to us important because it speaks of an asymmetry whereby if you are, a corporate actor and you want to move anywhere you want in order to maximize your profits, you are very much encouraged to do that, even supported, to do that by way of tax rebates to you. But if you are an individual seeking a better possibility for you to sell the only thing you have, and that is your ability to work, then you don't have the same rights. I think it's very important to understand that these are events, again, that have taken place during the same period of time. I also want to highlight that by and large, the people who are moving are indeed moving using so-called regularized, mechanisms. However, we tend to focus on the people who migrate without authorization because they become the easiest social subject to demonize. And to the extent that we can demonize them, we can abuse them in any way we want. And I think it's important to understand that when somebody like the former president of the United States of America spoke of migrants as people who are rapists, people who are killers, he wasn't just talking about the people entering the country without authorization. He was talking about basically everybody. But it begins, with the people that are supposed to be breaking the law, because part of this toxic narrative I was mentioning also paints people of color, particularly, as people that are by nature law breakers. And that is also part of the narrative that is sold. And the last issue that I want to raise in this moment, William, is the relationship between enforcement and money making. Because in the United States of America, for example, detaining foreign nationals because they have committed immigration law infractions leads to literally tens of thousands of people being in detention on a nightly basis. I have to say that this has changed a little bit over the past 3-4 months. But up until 3-4 months ago, any given night, you had up to 55,000 people in detention facilities in the US. And believe me, it is an incredibly profitable business model because the cost of keeping people in detention is very low. but the average price that they get per night per individual is in the $140, $145 per night. So you can imagine how profitable this type of business can be. But the same can be said about deportation, because deportation is often a boom, for companies that are in the business of basically selling charter flights to fly people back, to countries throughout the Americas, but particularly Mexico and Central American nations. So the last thing I would say, William, is that we have been seeing, as you well said, a lot of focus on so-called families, unaccompanied minors, trying to enter the US in very increased numbers over the past few months. And I have to say, a lot of it is really a manufactured crisis. It is not really a genuine crisis in the sense that these numbers are not really unprecedented. These are numbers that are consistent with other moments in history over the past 4 decades. And they're even seasonally pretty much a standard, because in the first 5-6 months of every year, we always see an increase in the numbers of people trying to enter the US without authorization. And I have to say, I think that the fact that we have a new president now has opened up some possibilities for change. But I have to say, I enjoy very much watching the president giving an address to the Congress just last week. But, even though he said very nice things, let's remember, 4 decades of toxic, consistent, negative narrative about foreign nationals will not be changed by one presidential speech. We need to absolutely change dramatically the way we talk about immigrants, and we need to focus on one absolute truth. Migration has been extremely beneficial, for a country like the US, but it has also been very beneficial for countries like Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, the Dominican Republic, even Cuba, for that matter. And we don't talk about that. And that is the truth, as I said, and that's what we should put at the center of any debate about immigrants, migration, or people seeking humanitarian protection.
Thank you, Oscar, for that. And I think that was brilliant in terms of how, again, you, Michelle, and Patrick seem to be on the same wavelength of deconstructing something that has been built over years and almost even confined us in a certain way to think of these issues. But I like how you actually started, and I think this is the first time I have actually heard irregular migration and the way it is constructed defined as an issue of white supremacy. So I think that is something we really, really need to explore and get more to the bottom of this. I know a colleague of mine, Evelyn, even shares an article by another colleague that says, and if Evelyn, you're on the call, of how this migration goes back to colonial times kind of thing, and colonial thinking even. So it would be fantastic to see how we unpack some of this to show that the current discourse is built on very flawed kind of perceptions. Thank you for that. I like the idea of the money kind of thing, the free movement of capital, but restrictions. And I think this is something that we have to start looking at, this whole question of demonizing migrants and making a big hoo-ha about regular flows, which, like you are saying, happen in your context, but how media picks it up and it gets demonized. But I like also the hope you are ending up with, but the cautious hope that you are ending up with as well with the new president. And so, in your perspective, then, and because the GCM is or the US is not part of the GCM, has not yet come forward to say that we are going to be at the GCM. Yet the new president has taken big steps in, for example, the climate conference he called up very recently within his, I think it was just a little bit after his 100 days or within the 100 days, this big climate conference. So it shows that he's willing to take on big issues. I'm wondering if this is a moment again for the US to take leadership in some ways, given by that very statement that you have made of how beneficial migration has been for the US and for the countries in the region that you described. So what would you think then for us as civil society? How can we urge the US if at the moment it is a reluctant champion because the GCM is looking for champion states kind of thing, and the UN network is looking for champion states, how can we act or advocate for the US, which might be a reluctant champion, to step up to the plate in this regard? Any thoughts on that?
Well, let me try to be very candid about it. I mean, I think that we have a situation in the US today with the new administration where there seems to be a real contradiction between the people who are policy thinkers, policy designers, who absolutely understand that migration has been extremely beneficial to the US and extremely beneficial to many of the countries of origin of the largest immigrant groups in the US, and that therefore anything we say or do from a policy perspective should be based on that premise. And again, I mean, I know some of the people who are in the Biden administration, and I know they share, what I just said. But at the same time, there are some political people in the administration who still fear very deeply being perceived as being too nice to lawbreakers, to put it bluntly. And these political types, I mean, are very concerned that because there is not yet a new narrative that defines the way we talk, both politically and publicly, about migration, that this may present a very serious challenge to the Democratic Party, given the fact that we have midterm elections coming up next year in 2022. And these political types fear that there may be a backlash in as far as punishing Democrats for being too nice, to lawbreakers, being too nice to people who are perceived to be a threat to the country. And that contradiction you can see playing out very consistently. Let me give you a couple of examples. In the campaign, the Biden administration was very strongly critical about the policies that were put in motion by the previous government, the Trump administration. Particularly, Biden was very critical of separating families, and not giving families with children, especially, due protection. Yet, when they come into the presidential role, they pretty much put that, on a back burner. I mean, they don't want to handle it right away because, again, the political types tend to dominate. Second example I can give you, Biden promised that he was going to restore the annual number of refugees to a level similar to the one in place during the Obama years. Interestingly, about 2.5 weeks ago on a Friday, they suddenly announced that they will actually keep the limits that the Trump administration put in place. And there was a huge backlash, from people all over the political spectrum in the US, and people concerned, with the perception that this administration was, again, basically copying from the previous one, and they reversed course. Just a day ago, actually, the Secretary of State has announced that they will increase the number to 62,500 per year for fiscal year 2021. That is still about half of what they actually promised they would do. And again, from my perception, the conflict between the policy-minded folks and the political-minded folks is one that will need to get resolved if we are to see the Biden administration, not only domestically, but internationally, playing a real leadership role in as far as basically honoring the, as I said before, the absolutely undeniable fact that migration over the past 40 years in particular, but throughout history, has been extremely beneficial to the United States of America. It's been extremely beneficial to countries of origin, and we should have the courage, in this case from the government, to announce that very loudly and very consistently, domestically and internationally. And if that were to happen, I think that we all would see a much better role by the United States of America than we have seen so far.
And thank you again. Thank you for that. And I think as you say about constructing the new narrative and the link you made between white supremacy and Evelyn's in the chat there about Tendai Ochume's thing on racism and migration, it might be good for us to see how we construct a narrative that then challenges the policymakers to look at some of the policies that are in place that are flawed, and hopefully that this pandemic itself will give us cause to rethink of the world that we want to create. And I know the US president is talking of a former president who played a defining role in the US kind of thing, and I hope that this would be a moment for that. Oscar, I know you've got to leave, so I will ask you to give me one phrase or one sentence of what you think would be an action-oriented approach that we need to take moving forward.
You know, I want to pick up on what you just said about COVID. COVID-19 has challenged the entire humanity, and it has challenged us to dare, you know, to put forward proposals that are absolutely radically different than the past. We all know that it's not good enough to go back to where we were before. And so from that perspective, let me put forward one idea. We should be calling for the immediate release of anybody who is actually brought under authorities in charges related to simply having committed a migration law infraction. And I don't talk about alternatives to detention. I'm talking about freedom. I'm talking about liberty. Because let's face it, just as it is the case in the US, the same is true all over the world. Migrants are a true blessing, you know, for societies. And if that is indeed the case, we should not be holding anybody from being free. We should be actually helping people, not only to be free, but also to help them be able to enjoy access to legal advice so that they can navigate these crazy rules that ultimately we have to change. But in the meantime, you need, you know, professional advice to be able to navigate them. So we are very much in this line of thinking as far as Alianza Americas is concerned, really pushing hard for breaking once and for all with this notion that we have to punish people, because we should be thanking them, not punish them at all.
Thanks for that, Oscar. And I love that idea to go beyond what is the current discourse on alternatives and to try to get to a deeper understanding of freedom and liberty means in the exercise of full understanding of human rights. So thank you for that. Thank you for that action point.
And William, keep in mind that Elena Olea is in the call. And if need be, if there are any questions about what I said, you can ask her and blame her.
Perfect. Thanks, Helena, and I hope you heard that. Okay, so let me move on to Rima Kalush, and Rima Kalush is with migrantrights.org. And Rima has done a lot of work in the Middle Eastern region as well in looking at this issue on undocumented migrants. It has, and in the Middle Eastern region, the notion there is absconding, illegal. This is we have still a long way to go before these terms actually, get some sensibility, even rationality around them in the way we use it. But Rima, what do you see as the main challenges in let's say, the Middle Eastern region and the Gulf region around this issue? And are there any particular corridors that you think would be important for us to focus on?
Yeah, thank you, William, for allowing me to share a bit about the Gulf context, which I initially thought was going to be quite different from what other people were sharing, but I'm realizing it's really not too different, unfortunately. And the Gulf is a bit unique in that its dependence on foreign labor is extreme, 50% to 90% in all of the countries. And so access to the Gulf is comparatively quite easy. It's not too difficult to obtain an employment visa, and it's also not too difficult to obtain a visit visa, kind of no matter your nationality. And so the vast majority of migration is through regular channels. And so I was really glad that you and Patrick and everyone else kind of, was problematizing this whole lens of regular versus irregular migration, and also the focus that's on, pathways. So I think that kind of distances countries from their own accountability to what happens to migrants once they enter the country. So, in the Gulf, migrants can have as safe and orderly as a migration pathway as possible, and they're still going to face the same issues as someone who might have entered in irregularly. So most of the workers who do become irregular become so because employers are in charge of their residency permits. And so if an employer just chooses not to obtain a residency permit for them, or if they choose to cancel a residency permit, and the worker is unable to obtain a new job within the sort of period that's allowed, or the employer intervenes to make sure that that worker cannot change jobs, they can do that by lodging a criminal case, but most people will do it by lodging an absconding case, which is one of the most problematic controls of the kafala system that remains in each of the GCC countries. And in fact, it's only been made easier over the past few years. You can now lodge an absconding case, using an app, and in fact, employers are encouraged to do so. And so most of the ways that workers fall into irregularity is because it's out of their control. And oftentimes they're not able to even, contest their status. And so what happens to, workers who, receive an absconding charge is they often become immediately irregular and then subject to indefinite detention and, and eventual deportation. And for most of the cases that we have seen, there's generally not an opportunity to sort of contest that. Sometimes there are, investigations, but they don't go to court, and there's the issues of sort of translation and legal services. There are workers who do come in on visit visas, whether that's through a recruitment agency who's kind of promised that they'll change the visa once they arrive in the country, or it's just workers who are trying to come and scope out work. For those workers who are sort of unable to then find a sponsor and convert their visa into an employment visa, then they can also, fall into irregularity. I think it's also important to note that there are some migrants who do come with sort of the intention of leaving their employers and sort of joining their communities and working from their communities, especially amongst domestic workers. It's unfortunate that this is sort of criminalized, because the idea of, just being able to sort of freely work for anyone you want shouldn't be something that is criminalized. And so essentially you have this system that's producing, irregularity. And so that's why you see sort of every few years, the Gulf states will launch these amnesty campaigns in which workers who are irregular can either regularize their status by finding an employer and paying a fine, or they can leave the country without paying any fines. And so the fact that you have these countries where the majority of people are entering through regular channels, and yet every few years you still have hundreds of thousands of people who are falling into an irregular status, and therefore you need to have these campaigns, it's kind of proof positive that these issues are systemic. But because there's a reluctance to look at the root causes of irregularity, we still see that amnesties are sort of the preferred tools of Gulf countries. And I want to just quickly also mention sort of where workers are not maybe entering through, regular channels. So through sort of the borderlands between, UAE and Kuwait and UAE and Oman, I think what we would characterize there is more so trafficking than irregular migration. So often workers are brought to the UAE through visit visas and then brought into the UAE and Kuwait, often in, often as domestic workers or as agricultural workers. But where we see sort of the greatest number and also the greatest kind of violations is actually at the Saudi-Yemen border. And I think this is kind of an area that it's been reported on quite a bit by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, and there've been several interviews with returnees from the IOM as well. But I think oftentimes when we are focused on the Gulf, we're so focused on labor migration that we often don't, I think, give these issues as much justice as they should receive. And so the Saudi-Yemen border has just been the site of, gross abuse for over a decade now. It's primarily Yemeni migrants and migrants from the Horn of Africa, primarily Ethiopia. Some of them who need to enlist middlemen or traffickers in order to try to cross the border to find work in Saudi or elsewhere in the Gulf countries. And so it's been a sort of traditional route of mobility for a long time, but over the past few years, the border has been increasingly securitized, and so we've seen pushbacks. We've seen migrants who are shot at, migrants who are, rounded up and put into detention centers, and then migrants who are either, able to find their way in, perhaps through bribing bribing border guards. But eventually, even those migrants who do make it in and who are working in Saudi for a couple of years eventually are rounded up in campaigns and deported as well. And this unfortunately hasn't stopped even during COVID-19. There were thousands of primarily Ethiopian workers who had been detained at the border, but also rounded up from within the kingdom and then placed into these detention centers. I think the objective initially was to sort of deport all of them, and then when there was an international outcry, they ceased the deportations, but then they've been stuck in these just, in terrible conditions in detention centers across the country. As of a couple of months ago, I think Saudi has promised to sort of start repatriating them after much pressure from media reporting and the UN as well, which is a welcome move. But I think it's really unfortunate that this is a recurrent issue. It's something that happens every 2 to 3 years, where we see hundreds of thousands and upwards of 1 million workers, primarily Ethiopian workers, who are rounded up in Saudi and deported. And there doesn't seem to be a cohesive strategy. I'm hoping that with the UN network in migration now based in Saudi, it might start to stop the agenda. But yeah, so those are kind of the main issues that we're seeing now.
No, thanks, Rima, for that, and I'm glad you pointed that out in terms of a corridor that is very little reflected on in the international news or by the international community, but definitely a very important corridor, and we've seen a lot of human rights abuses along that corridor as well. But I also like of how you in the Middle Eastern region. It's largely an issue of migrant workers and their status kind of thing. So when we look at some of the other regions like Oscar and Michelle talking about, and they talk about regular pathways and things like that, I think it's a far cry to think of regular pathways in the sense of permanent residentships, pathway to citizenships, and things like that. But in the recent policies and all, do you think there is some genuine movement towards kind of seeing that this old formula of labor migration temporary programs is now unraveling, and some of the Gulf states are beginning to look at other possibilities? Is that something that is happening, or is it just a lot of PR stunt?
It's, in my opinion, it's quite the latter. And unfortunately, I think we're even seeing sort of UN organizations who are adopting the language of the Gulf states, which is calling these migrant workers foreign temporary contractual workers. In sort of a way to sort of further distance themselves from their obligations to migrants. There have been a number of reforms over recent years, but none of them get at sort of the heart of what the kafala is. And they're often implemented alongside other reforms, which are always going to ensure that there is an element of control over migrant workers. There's such a large sort of demographic fear that I really don't see anytime soon that this is going to change. And there's also, of course, always the exclusion of certain segments of migrant workers, most often domestic workers, from these regulations at all. But if we look at Qatar, if we look at Saudi, if we look at the UAE, sort of the countries that have had the most reforms to the kafala system, none of them get really at the two issues that are kind of at the heart of the system, which is employers' control over residency documents, and also the employer's ability to lodge an absconding charge against workers. So, Qatar has had some of the most sort of profound reforms, but this ability for employers to lodge absconding charges against workers kind of undoes a lot of what its potential impact could be. There was a lot of sort of celebration in Bahrain of the flexi permit, and this has been the closest to sort of a complete overhaul of the system in that workers could self-sponsor themselves. And it's a good idea in theory, but the way that it was implemented means that it's not really a step towards anything else that could be applied sort of systemically. And so under that system, only workers who are already irregular can apply for it. And it's very expensive. It's more expensive than it costs for an employer to sponsor a worker. And it's not reflective of sort of Bahrain's own local economy. And so it's been very problematic in that sense. And also those workers don't have the same sort of labor rights as other workers. And so I don't know, you see like all of these kind of seemingly promising practices across the region, but if you just look a little bit closer, there's one, implementation is always an issue, but two, there's all of these other barriers are just always erected at the same time. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't really see much positive progress being made. In fact, I think we're seeing a regress, even if we're looking outside of sort of like labor laws and things like that, when we're looking at countries that are making it more difficult for people to sponsor their parents and their family members, such as in Saudi Arabia or in Kuwait, where there's now an upper age limit on working visas. I think the only place we're seeing any kind of change is for the very, very, very top tier of migrant workers who these Gulf states are trying to attract.
No, thanks, Rima. And I must say, I think the sign that there was an irritation in your throat when you were talking about UN agencies even buying into this framework, I think is a good sign for us to pay attention to, because this is something that is really indeed troubling, of how in the region itself, UN agencies are buying into this temporary labor migration discourse. I know as civil society, we have challenged this from the very first years of the GFMD kind of thing, to look at, alternatives and things like that. But we, at least in this region, we see that this is the biggest challenge. And of course, like you say, it's the undermining of workers' rights, which leads to disempowerment and then issues of forced labor and things like that. So it's a long way to go in this regard. So thank you as well for pointing that out. All right. Let me now, I would like the panelists also, for those who are competent in some of the other languages, to please look at the chat box and see what are some of the questions or comments that are there that you would want to take up. But I know we had Joel from the ITUC in Africa, from the African Regional Office of the ITUC to be a fifth panelist, but I've been told that he is not yet with us. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to the platform. I'm going to go to the platform and I'm going to ask people in the platform if you want to ask questions and things like that. There could be a way of you raising your hands and speaking. But before I start identifying, and I will ask the panelists to take in those comments, and I'll call you back in towards the last half hour to give your comments on some of what you have been hearing. But let me go to the platform now. And since Joel from Africa is not joined us yet, I was wondering, Richard, you've been putting comments in the chat box. Would you like to make a few comments here? Richard,
yes, yes, sir.
Go ahead, Richard.
Thank you so much, William, and thanks to the panelists and all the participants all over the world. Yes, I was really moved by the point made by Patrick, and then Shalon, in the sense that migration issues in East Africa per se is really curtailed. And one thing we've realized is because of the leadership. I think East Africa, as you all know, is trying to undergo what we call political federation. And the process to attain that political federation is called political confederation, and already consultation is taking place. But I think there's suspicion among some of the leaders. And because of that, each of the governments, they're actually suspicious of the other. And that makes the citizens, the ordinary citizen, to be at stake in the daily work, in their daily operations and work. For instance, the case in point is the issue between Sudan and Uganda, South Sudan and Uganda. The political tension between between Uganda and Rwanda. And then also the issue between Kenya and Uganda. You must have also seen how sugar and other items from Uganda were being blocked. And now that all will not augur well in the East African integration agenda that they are trying to push. But at the end of it all, it's the ordinary citizen that suffer, because most of these leaders, they are not affected by some of the decisions they make. And for that matter, we need to put this government some of this government into, we need to put them on the spot. That, well, you know, in order for you to govern people well, you must be doing things that are actually in line with the aspirations of the people. And as civil society organization in the region, and we are a very prominent organization, we actually want to undertake a profiling study, especially the conflict between South Sudan and Uganda at the border communities between Uganda and South Sudan. And in my thesis, I actually wrote, can East African community, can the Great Lakes region, can they concentrate more on refugee producing factors instead of leaving some of those factors that they could actually use to minimize the adverse effect of people leaving their countries because of war and all that? It's much more expensive for them to address refugee situation than when they address some of those structural issues that make people leave their countries of origin and move to another countries as refugees. Yeah, I think I can stop at that for the moment. Thank you so much, William, for this opportunity.
No, thank you, Robert, for willing to take the floor. And I think you have raised some very, very pertinent questions with regard to what happens at the borders. And this does not come out very often, except, and particularly in the borders that you have mentioned. They don't make big headlines, but these are very big issues, and we need to start looking at it. I like the connect you made with Patrick in saying there have been free movement regimes within the African region, and we might come back to Patrick on that at some later on. But I see now also there is the UNMGCY there. I see Martha and I see Elena, two of you. I'd like to know what you are thinking of at the moment as you think of as you've heard some of the speakers say, new political thinking, that the COVID gives us an opportunity to reset and things like that. And on this particular issue, Martha or Elena, do you want to come in at this stage? This is the youth network.
Thank you, William. I think there should actually be one of our other members. Elana, can you help me find them?
All right. While we are waiting for Elena to, and if you can let me know who the other person is, I see Martina Lischbeck here as well. Martina, you want to come in here? And anybody else who wants to raise hands? I see Britt Brennan from the movement as well. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, Britt, as well. Martina, you want to take the floor? Martina Lischbeck? No? All right. Let me, Britt Brennan. Britt?
Yes, hello. Yeah, hello, William. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, who is this?
This is Breed Brennan.
Oh, go ahead, Britt, go ahead.
Well, yes, I've been listening very attentively to this very important discussion and debate in relation to regular and irregular migration. I think some very important points were made by those who are contributing to the conversation. I think one of the most important, I think was underlined by Oscar, which I think fits very much to our experience also in Europe, that the central issue is really the question of not only what's been happening in relation to migrant and refugee policy, but what has been happening in relation to human rights policy in the last 20 years. And certainly in the context of Europe, I mean, our experience both in relation to borders, and that goes for the reality of forbidden rescue of people in the seas, as well as on land, and the criminalization of those. We have a very important campaign at the moment of Elena Molina, who's been one of the really key persons in the network of the alarm phone, is now facing a case both in Morocco and in Spain. And you know, her record really is support to saving lives and preventing deaths at sea, of which I think we can agree that we have a very important. Well, we have a total deterioration in the sense of the rights of rescue in relation to migrants and refugees crossing the Mediterranean and the Aegean seas. And maybe just what I would like to share is that, yeah, there's been a very 3-year process of the Permanent People's Tribunal, which had some very important conclusions in relation to the status of the rights of migrants and refugees in Europe, putting it in the context of systemic crimes, meaning that our economic and political system it creates the conditions, and we see it now with TRIPS, for example, where governments might want to access COVID medicines, they are prevented because of the system in the UN. So likewise, migrants and refugees and those working with them who want to access rights in Europe are not actually able to do so in any significant way. And yeah, finally, I think it's good to share with you and with those who are listening that yeah, one of the main and active calls that we have is that it's not a crime to migrate, it's not a crime to seek refuge, it's a human right. And this really was very much inspired by a Cameroon migrant who gave testimony at the very first tribunal we had in Barcelona. So it's not a crime to migrate, it's not a crime to seek refuge, it's a human right. And we really also feel we need to return to the spirit of the spirit and the letter actually of the convention, on the International Convention on the rights of migrants and their families. So
Thanks.
Thank you very much for a very, very important debate.
Thank you, Bridget, and thank you for that voice of migrants that you brought as well, of our friend from Cameroon who said it's not a crime to migrate or to seek refuge. That's very pointedly exactly what Oscar was saying a little while ago as well. From the youth, have you got anybody? Have you identified who it was going to speak? Martha or Elena, if you could let me know. I'd like to also call on Laura Morel. Laura, you want to say where you're from?
Yes, William, thank you. Can you hear me well?
Very clearly, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you to all the different interventions and comments for this very interesting webinar. And of course, here at Secours Catholique Caritas France, we definitely hear the very important challenges and issues that are rising around irregular migration and the access for regular pathways of migration. And we see that here in France, migrant people and documented migrants are facing very difficult situation and are very vulnerable. And what is also important for us is also the vulnerabilities of people displaced in the context of disasters and climate change, and the access for these people of safe and regular pathways of migration. And we are very engaged to joint actions with other actors, civil society, to engage in this very important work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura, and I think that is coming out of this webinar already. The more we join hands to reinforce, I was just going to say that, to reinforce Oscar's and what the other panelists have been saying in terms of how we build alliances moving forward and deconstructing some of this. But I see Don Flynn on this, and I know Don Flynn has done a lot of work on this as well many years ago. Don, it would be nice to just hear your voice. You want to come in here? Don Flynn, on some of the work that you've been doing.
Hello, William. Can you hear me now?
Hi, Don. Yeah, that's right. Go ahead, Don.
How nice to hear from you. Yes, I mean, I've enjoyed listening in on the discussion today. I think primarily from the UK context where I'm now pretty well exclusively doing my work, having pulled back, I think, from the various networks when I hit retirement age a few years ago. But it certainly is the case, I think, that the movements in the UK are beginning to face up to the possibility of a regularization campaigns being undertaken, which is something that we've not been bold enough, I think, for quite some time to contemplate doing that, feeling ourselves for a long time very much on the back foot with governments that have been pursuing much more tightly controlled managed migration policies, which essentially have been about pushing back on rights that had once existed for migrants. And over a period of 40 odd years or so, there's been this constant erosion within this. We've now, paradoxically, I think, when we've got probably the most right-wing government that we've had for a long time, apparently firmly ensconced in power, and this is all becoming more realistic to us, because of we're now living at the point where we're witnessing the absurdity of the system, which is deregularizing migrants, criminalizing them, pushing them further and further back. And of course, in the UK, we've had the experience of what we've come to refer to, it was actually the official name of government policy, the hostile environment, a deliberate set of policies which were being created by government in order to place pressure on migrants, for them to feel continually that they are living on the margins of UK society, and any transgression as far as complex sets of immigration rules are concerned will lead them to them being excluded altogether. And this really exposed itself in its most ridiculous form in the experience of Caribbean migrants in the UK, who typically had come into the country back in the 1960s and 1970s, but under the terms of a hostile environment, were now having their right to remain in the country being challenged, and being deprived of, in the first instance, ancillary rights like the right to welfare benefits, the right to work, the right to rent in the private rented sector. You're dealing with a group of people who are now into their 60s or 70s, been paying tax in the country all of this time, and they were suddenly being exposed to this sort of treatment. And this had the effect of rallying the country, or at least large sections of the population, to the absurdities of the immigration control, the direction it was taking. And this has also coincided with the Black Lives Matter protests, which have been underway, and a big public debate about decolonizing the academy, and also, which is now spilled over into decolonizing immigration policy as well. So that's summarizing where we are in the UK at the moment. And after having stood back for quite a long while, I think, from engagement with all of my comrades in the international networks, I do think that in the very near future, we're going to have an opportunity to go out with a great deal more confidence and to start talking again about these issues. And I think to re-engage with all of the campaigns, which it's now well time that we should be getting underway once again. So thank you very much.
Great, Don, and thanks for that, for putting out that prospect that you'll be coming back and joining us, because this is a time that we would need to do some collective thinking and mobilizing to see how. And I like what you and others have been saying so far in this call today, that there is a history that has been undermined, and on that, and and on that history, new structures and new policies have been put, which has constructed a narrative that we need to fight against. And so that's a good thing that you and others have talked about colonization, racism, and white supremacy, and how we need to connect the dots on these issues when you talk about migration and irregular migration. So thank you for that. I see. Let me just for the sake of, and I'll ask my colleagues to help me, since is there any French speaker in the platform that wants to take the floor? Any French speaker that wants to take the floor? Any Spanish speaker that wants to take the floor? And any Arabic speaker that wants to take the floor? Any French speaker? I see Marta Rojas. Okay, I'm hoping you're French. If you're not French and Spanish, if you're not go ahead. Marta, I see your hand.
Sí, hola, gracias. ¿Me escuchan?
Go ahead.
Okay,
go
gracias.
Ahead. Go ahead.
Gracias, William. Sí, yo soy académica en Chiapas, en la frontera sur de México, y pertenezco al bloque latinoamericano de migración, una red de organizaciones y de académicos que abogamos por los derechos y estamos participando también en el diálogo. Acabamos de participar en el diálogo regional para el Pacto Mundial de Migración. Y bueno, he estudiado durante 20 años la migración centroamericana a México. Y bueno, abonando, contribuyendo a lo que ya dijeron los panelistas, en el caso mexicano, se tiene la idea de que el régimen de control restrictivo es relativamente reciente. Sin embargo, desde 1990 a la fecha, México ha llevado a cabo 3 millones, casi 4 millones de deportaciones, de eventos de deportación. En promedio, alrededor de unas 120,000, 130,000 deportaciones al año. Y recientemente, pues estamos muy preocupados por la situación de los migrantes que han decidido migrar en caravana, porque la violencia en México es extremadamente fuerte en contra de los migrantes, la violencia, digamos, del crimen organizado, de las bandas de criminales que por las rutas de migrantes asaltan a los migrantes, los torturan, los secuestran, y las políticas cada vez más restrictivas en este país hacen que las personas tengan que buscar rutas alternativas para poder lograr su objetivo de llegar al norte de México, es decir, a la frontera con Estados Unidos, y en particular ahora cuando hay, o desde hace más de 20 años, cuando hay efectos llamada del gobierno estadounidense, que va a haber una amnistía o que se van a facilitar los procesos o que va a haber asilo para algunas nacionalidades. Entonces hay un movimiento de personas que quieren llegar al norte. La violencia en México ha derivado en que muchas personas deseen o busquen alternativa de solicitar asilo en México. Entonces tenemos situaciones extremadamente difíciles con la pandemia, de personas que están inmovilizadas en algunas zonas del país porque los servicios en las oficinas se han detenido, ha sido más lento el proceso y las facilidades para la regularización migratoria no han sido las esperadas. Entonces nosotros también creemos que la regularización no es la solución, pero sí es una vía para lograr certeza jurídica y sobre todo, como ya lo dijo al principio Patrick, para buscar la protección y para buscar la inclusión social de personas. Y definitivamente debemos caminar hacia una educación de la sociedad en favor de que la migración es positiva. Hay que cambiar la narrativa tóxica, como ya lo dijo Oscar, hacia una narrativa que vea en las personas migrantes personas, y no criminales o no, ¿verdad? Claro, por supuesto, perdón, quiero decir que las personas también, los criminales también son personas, pero que las personas migrantes son personas sujetas de derechos que necesitan protección y que están buscando una mejor opción de vida frente a situaciones económicas bastante restrictivas y precarias en sus países. Gracias.
Thank you, Mother. Thank you so much. I must say you spoke in Spanish, but I heard you in perfect English. So that's great. Let me see. Any French speaker? Any French speaker wants to take the floor? All right. If there's no French speaker that wants to take the floor, then I will ask an Arabic speaker, and I'll ask Sarah Khatib. You put some good news there in the chat. Sarah, you want to come in here? Sarah Khatib?
Okay. So,
Go ahead.
Okay. ممكن أشارك شيء أنا كتبته already في الشات عن إنجاز جديد بالأردن. حققوا مركز التضامن سوليداريتي سنتر مع شركائهم في المجتمع المدني والنقابات العمالية المستقلة. هذا إنجاز لحملة حول شمول عمال الزراعة في الأردن، وهو قطاع اقتصاد غير رسمي بمظلة قانون العمل بشكل صريح. وقمنا بتقديم مسودة نموذجية لنظام عمال الزراعة على نحو بيشمل العمال المهاجرين واللاجئين بهذا القطاع بحمايات متساوية كمان مع العمال الأردنيين. وعلى مدار سنتين تقريبا كنا عم نقود هاي الحملة، وكثفنا جهودنا في الإعلام وفي مخاطبة الحكومة. وانتهت قبل يومين أو تكللت يعني هاي الحملة قبل يومين بإصدار نظام لعمال الزراعة بالأردن شملهم صراحة بقانون العمل، وأعطاهم حمايات متساوية بالأجور وساعات العمل، وبيعتد بالعمل المؤقت والموسمي، والحمايات متساوية أيضاً للمهاجرين واللاجئين. ومن أهم الأمور كانت شمولهم بالضمان الاجتماعي، فحتى المهاجرين في هذا القطاع بالقانون حيكونوا مشمولين بالقانون الاجتماعي، وهذا إنجاز تاريخي. لكن يبقى أنه نراقب تنفيذ القانون وآليات إنفاذه. حبيت أشارك هاي التجربة من الأردن.
I love that. What remains to be seen whether it will be implemented on the ground. So let's continue to monitor that, and let's continue to celebrate these small successes, little successes that we have, and count them. Let me now, before I go to the panel, do a very quick 1-minute round kind of thing with 3 people that I would like to see them weigh in on this conversation. One is Ellen Sana. Ellen Sana, if you are there. The second is, I see Kathy there, Kathy Taktakin. And I see my good friend from the ILO, Richard Sholvinsky, who is also a colleague of Patrick Taran. So I'll do it in that order, a quick 1-minute round with each one of you. Ellen Sana.
Hi, William. I'm sorry. I almost forgot the webinar. So I came in only like a few minutes ago. I'm really sorry. I'll just be listening. Thank you.
Thanks, Ellen, for that. Kathy Taktakin. Kathy, you want to come in here?
Sure. Thanks, William. Great to hear you and everyone else. In the chat, I just commented that our fight for regular pathways, which should include regularization and regular migration, asylum, refugees, really has to be worked done hand in hand with fighting enforcement regimes, and what Oscar reinforced, the ideological backdrop to that of racism and white supremacy. And if we don't do that, we undermine our efforts to really push politicians, especially at national levels, to support either administrative or legislative options for regular migration. So they really go hand in hand. And what I said was they're two sides of the same coin. So I would just encourage us to keep that in mind. So there's a regional context, but it's really at national levels that we really have to do both. It's work that has to go together.
And that's a good reminder for all of us in this platform, because we did say this whole thing is a momentum kind of that we are trying to build, but that momentum starts on the ground at the national level. So let's listen to some of this, take it to the national level, see how it resounds there, resonates there, how that struggles there, and then we come back 8 weeks to say what this means. So thanks for that reminder, Kathy. Richard Cholwinsky, you've been hearing a lot, and yours was the first article that introduced me to this issue when I read your article on undocumented migrants and Migrant Workers Convention. Richard, you want to come in now?
Thank you, William. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Thank you. Well, like Ellen, I wasn't able to catch everything, but and I had to sort of leave at some point and return to the conversation. But just some reflections. I agree with many of the speakers at the beginning, and the way they we're discussing both regular and irregular migration, and that when we look at migration globally, it's overwhelmingly regular, and yet the focus and the narrative and the toxicity is around the whole issue of irregular migration, and of course there are some very unfortunate and tragic cases around irregular migration that attract a lot of attention, and we should not forget about the lives that are lost of such migrants, of such human beings. But this should not dominate the discourse. So that I think is extremely important. And the other point that I wanted to pick up on, which I've seen in the EU context, but also elsewhere, is, and it was referred to particularly by my former colleague Patrick, this really increasing securitization of migration, right? Which is, if anything, become even more evident during the pandemic. Particularly in the context of mobility restrictions, both within and across borders. This is, again, a very damaging discourse, and something that is important to be vigilant about going forward. And coupled with this is the amount of resources that are often expended in the context of, what is still often referred to as migration management, particularly on the private company side, not just in the context of managing detention centers, but also border management. So these things sort of go hand in hand. Thank you, William. Yeah.
Thanks, Richard, for that. And let me just remind everybody, this is a series. And Richard, just in case you missed that point, one of the issues was, particularly on this issue and things like on irregular migration, it's one of the challenges that was mentioned in the conversation today is the challenge we have with the UN system itself, of how sometimes in some regions of the world, the UN system seems to be buying into a narrow kind of framing of the issue. And this might be something that we will explore in future dimensions of this series. But this might be something worth considering and looking at how to explain that, or how to look at that, or how to debate on that. I think it would be an important area to look at. All right, let me come back to the panel now. You have been listening. You have been listening to each other, and you have been listening to the chat box, and you have been listening to some of the people that took the floor as well. What's going through your head as an action-oriented agenda? What should we be doing? What actions should we be concretely focusing around that could help create a mobilizing that could turn this way around? And let me start with you, Michelle. What are you thinking?
Thanks, William. Thanks to all for the great comments, the great insights. I think the last webinar that we did in the series, if I remember correctly, was the race and migration one. I think that was 2 weeks ago. I actually found that webinar quite profound because I think Oscar referred to 4 decades of demonization, basically, of irregular migrants in the US context. And actually, after listening to 2 hours of colleagues from around the world, I think we can easily talk of 400 years plus of demonizing of peoples, whether because they were indigenous in certain regions and then colonizers came in, whether they were brought from regions to others as slaves, whether because of economic reasons or ethnic reasons or whatever else within the same country, they're seen as different. And I actually think that to understand irregular migration, we have to deconstruct the whole racism and migration interplay. And I think that's also what Kathy Taktakwin and Oscar and others have also referred to. And Dawn also with the example from the UK, the Windrush example, for example. So I think that we have to and continue to do this, to deconstruct where we are today based upon where we're coming from. And then to note how big of a challenge it is, but not get overwhelmed by the challenge, because there are ways to chip away at some of the manifestations of this racism and discrimination that migrants face that's ingrained in policies. There's ways to chip away at it. And I think that the ways to do so are not necessarily just in the hardest area, which I do think is the migration policy area, but I think that it's also in combination with other areas. So it's in health policy, it's in education policy, it's in integration policy, which is part of migration policy anyway, but it's in gender policy, it's on children's issues. So it's only when we can actually make sure that those policies also see undocumented migrants in their approaches, that it shouldn't be acceptable, for example, in the EU, that in a new proposal on the Returns Directive, that children can still be legally detained by law for immigration reasons. That shouldn't be acceptable from a child rights policy. And yet this is still the proposal that the Commission has put forward. Why is it still a proposal? Because undocumented children or asylum seeking children are not seen as children. They're seen as objects of migration policy. And so it's deconstructing kind of all of this ingrained mentality and years of discrimination through all these other policy channels, I think, that we can maybe start to see some progress. And it's a big challenge, and it's definitely not been one that's light for the people who are experiencing it, the migrants themselves. And as Brennan was saying, people helping them. I mean, we have in the past 5 years in the EU, almost 200 cases of people who have been criminalized, who have had a court case against them because they've given water, or they've given shelter, or they've befriended migrants. I mean, that's the manifestation of it. So it's, I think that there's many different ways that we'll continue to do so, but it obviously remains a challenge. But I think what the webinar has shown is that they are huge challenges, but we have to think of strategic ways to also go about it.
Thank you, Michelle, and I've known you for many years, and I like how you think and how you give us that hope of chip away at it. and that's the framework that we will have to take as we look at the intersections between issues and the interconnectivity between issues, and that is something that I know that we've been doing and looking at for some years now. So it would be good to see how we develop a plan that actually chips away at it in future iterations of this webinar series, to see how this could be taken up. But definitely, I think we are onto something here today, because this is the first time I have heard so strongly a panelist talk about racism, colonialism, white supremacy in this context, in the context of migration and irregular migration and regular pathways. So thank you for that. Let me now come to Rima Kalush. Rima, what have you been hearing?
I've also really been reflecting on the racism issue as well. You know, in the Gulf, we often speak of a hierarchy of racism, where you have sort of the white expats at the top, and then sort of the Asian migrants, Asian expats in between. That terminology itself is quite telling. And then sort of the African migrants at the bottom, and you see that in how they're paid, as well as how they're treated, and how authorities treat them as well. So, like, I'm thinking about you know, the detention of over 20,000 Ethiopian workers in Saudi right now, and how much attention that would have received had they not been, you know, Black migrant workers. At the same time, I think this is kind of where we actually have in the Gulf the most room to work. So, you know, in the Gulf, where there's in general not a lot of room for civil society to work on legal change, attitudinal change and behavioral change and sort of societal change is where advocates and organizations can and have been working. So we've seen this with sort of even the BLM narrative making its way into the Gulf. There have been a number of discussions amongst Khalijis, as well as amongst citizens who are based in the region, about sort of overturning these attitudes towards migrants generally, and as well as towards you know, specific migrants coming from specific places. And so I do think there is some hope there. And that kind of links to the next bit that I want to say, which is that, you know, while this is a sphere that I think we can work in quite easily, and people have been doing it, the sphere that's much more difficult to work in is advocacy for legal change from within the national context. And this is why sort of the international spaces are so important, and why these reviews are so important, because one of the few leverages that we do have is that states are really concerned about their international image. And so it's important that, you know, we are using these spaces to sort of call them out, and not to do, unfortunately, what I think we saw at a lot of the regional review processes, which is, you know, we saw not only states coming out and doing their PR, which is expected, but also international organizations celebrating reforms that haven't happened. And so I think, you know, it's really crucial that, you know, while it's great that, yeah, we now have international organizations who are working in most of the Gulf countries on migration, their role should really be to ensure that they are amplifying the voices of people who are on the ground doing work, but who aren't able to participate in these spaces due to, you know, fear of retaliation. So.
Thanks, Rima. And I must say, I'm finding it, I find it strange and also very challenging how in the last 2-3 weeks, a little more over a month, I have heard how in different webinars, all of us somewhere resorting now to this one strategy, to the strategy of calling out for what it is. You know, I think somewhere in even as civil society, we have become, for fear of being thrown out of the room, or fear of not being invited to the dialogue, or for fear of losing out, or for whatever fear of not being part of something, we kind of allow certain constraints. And this is what some of the panelists have been saying as well. But I think it's time we really looked once again at an old time-tested strategy of calling out for what it is. And I think this is what people's struggle is all about as well. You know, the anti-colonial struggle, the anti-racism struggle is about calling it out for what it is, and it's a good strategy to put for us today in this webinar. Let me now come to Helena. Would you like to take the floor here for Oscar? Helena?
Yes, I can take the floor briefly. I just want to perhaps make a comment and try to highlight that there is a common thread between the series of webinars that we are putting in place. And I think that it's important to go back to the first discussion about labor migration and to consider also how there is a connection thread with the discussion about race, ethnicity, and migration, which I also think is a burning issue. And then how today, as we're talking about regularization, we're thinking about those two topics in the past, but we're also thinking forward about our next two discussions related to detention and deportation, and the last one on climate change, because I think that we have to be able to make the connections between topics. And I'm really pleased that the discussion about race, ethnicity, and migration has been taken over today, because I think that it's part of this deconstruction efforts. I also want to highlight that the challenge is how do we build proposals and how we build momentum around those proposals. And I think that that's the challenge. And I'm hoping that in the coming weeks, that's where our discussion takes us forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Helena, for pointing that out. I would, as a co-organizer of this, would have loved to have said this was all planned and the connections and things like that. But I'm glad you pointed out of how the panelists and the platform are making those connections. This is not making those connections both to past webinars and to upcoming webinars. And I think this is the important thing when we start looking at some of these objectives and how even SDGs are treated for that matter. How governments look at goals and objectives in particular, and then don't look at the interconnectivity. And I think a webinar like this and a series like this shows that also that there is an interconnectivity among these issues, and we've got to get down to the bottom of a rights-based approach. We will have to see these things in that light. But let me come to you now, Patrick. You started this off by talking about how something else existed. Regimes existed before that were much more hopeful, and now these kind of constraints and a bureaucracy and a reframing of some of this has been happening, and Oscar and others have talked about it happening for years like this. So it almost seems normal discourse today. And you said we need to challenge this because right to mobility is much bigger than this. Freedom is much bigger than this. What are you thinking and as seeing as an action point that could be a mobilizing point for us to move forward on these issues? Patrick, the platform is yours.
Well, thank you, William. I appreciate and have been pulling together in my mind the commentary and the discussion from panelists and of course from some of the people on the platform who've intervened. And I think there are three things I pull out of this, and one of them particularly strikes me. And that's the convergence of the discussion on irregular migration, return, racial supremacy, and demonizing people. And I come to the sense, and I wanted almost to jump in after Michelle a moment ago to say, we got a lot of this deconstructing to do, and we got to do it damn fast. Because listening to and understanding the discourse on return is understanding a discourse that is profoundly, and I would say extremely color-coded. You don't talk about return of Canadians from the US or now irregular UK people who lost their free movement status with Brexit and so on. But you certainly talk about returning anybody who's brown or black or another color. And in other racially or ethnic-based societies and Asian societies, you certainly talk about returning people because they're different, they're seen at a different level. And I think Rima just mentioned that even in the stratification among Arab peoples in the Gulf states, and of course with Asians and blacks and so on. But the point for me is the notion of return, its practice is extremely racialized. And I'm not sure I want to say racist, that's for you all to draw the conclusions. But the fact is, and my concern is, return is a fundamental platform of the GCM. And having not deconstructed its fundamental notion to the GCM, in some ways, I think civil society and a lot of activists and a lot of international organizations are tying themselves to a rock that's already taken us under the water. And that's problematic. And I link that then to a comment that Richard made about the notion of securitization and the resources that are going into it. I just looked up the resources the EU is putting into its so-called European Trust Fund, which is basically related to migration in Africa, almost all of which goes to migration control, to strengthening borders, and effect to undermining free movement regimes de facto, if not de jure. What's the figure? Oh, 50 million, 500 million? No, the current pledge in the screen in front of me says Europeans have now pledged 5 billion euros to huge amounts of funding that go to securitizing migration and in effect go to the forces within a lot of governments that are restrictionist and that within that context also raise these questions of return, of controlling movement, of in fact in some ways demonizing or closing borders. And I think Richard Obedi made a comment to that effect earlier in the chat and indirectly in his comment. But in return, coming back to your question, I have one piece that I think needs to be central to an alternative discourse. Actually, two pieces. One is basically there's a convention out there that needs to be ratified and implemented by every country. And it will basically, in so doing, domesticate to the extent possible that every migrant in this world, every refugee, has the full panoply of basic human rights. The second piece I want to put, which I think is the way forward in terms of actually dealing also with the social, economic, political context, is to move forward in supporting the implementation and the expansion of at least regional free movement. All of those regimes, or almost all of them, are based on rights that are not even in international instruments. The people have a right to move in their regional context to cross border. They have a right to residence in another country, and they have a right to do business or take up employment. And perhaps the good news, if you will, on that account is that now more than a quarter of all of the countries of the world are concerned by the adoption by the African Union heads of state and the African Union itself of a protocol on free movement for the entire continent, 55 member states. There are already 34 states that have signed and a few have ratified. But the point being that that's moving forward, but it's also being opposed internally and externally. And its counterparts within sub-regional economic communities are also being challenged. And all of those, to me, add up to one of the pieces that you asked for that needs to be part of a platform of response. And I would add, support the legal regime that every country must adopt, as every country is in one way or another bound as a matter of customary international law by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I just looked recently, I think all African countries, for example, have ratified at least 3 of the fundamental, two of the ILO fundamental conventions, and almost all African countries have ratified most of the other UN conventions on human rights, including CEDAW, CERD, and so on. I leave it at that. I'd like to say a lot more. I'd like to come back to Richard at some point to talk about what he alluded to, which is the importance of free movement in terms of, for example, all those commercial workers that cross borders and are now stopped at certain borders. Are Africa's key to development because they get local products in one country, they take them to another country and move around, stimulating local production and local consumption rather than obliging everybody to go to the local branch of Carrefour or Walmart or whatever to buy products made in USA and Europe. I think I'll leave it at that, but thank you, William.
No, thank you, Patrick. And I really like what you have said. 2 things. I like how you say we must go back to what is fundamental. Fundamental is human rights. Let's go back to those universal principles that everything that we do is based on. And the right to mobility is part of that fundamental rights. And we have conventions and legal standards that we must adhere to. Maybe it's time for the international community coming out of the pandemic to look at our history of the legal frameworks that we have put in place to guide us as an international community. And maybe it's time we went back to that and started looking at how we are adhering to that. So very good reminder of that. I like also your warning that you've given us, that some of these notions are like a big rock that we have tied ourselves to, and the compact is tied to, and we are underwater basically because of that. We need to surface from that. Oscar, Michelle, Helena, Rima have said this in the conversation, like so many others. We need to deconstruct some of this discourse that has built and becoming like a cage around us. So that's very important to keep in mind. I like what you started by saying, what we need to do, we need to act. And I like what Grace Princessa has said, who is a former ambassador to the UK, and that providentially a lot of these things have come together. These themes are connected. So let's take the cue then from those words that we have heard, Patrick. Fundamental human rights. Let's get back to that framework and let's act damn fast. Keep in mind there is another conversation next week focusing on detention and going beyond detention and beyond the discourse on alternatives. For everybody who was on this call, who stuck it out right up to the end, thank you so much. To the panelists, thank you for setting up this discussion, which will be food for us for thought as we take back down to the national and regional level and digest it and come back again 8 weeks from now at the international level again. But we will be keeping on, we'll keep on doing this, coming together, taking it back, coming together, taking it back. But this is the movement that we will build. And hopefully when we come to intergovernmental spaces, we will say the ground whispers and shouts differently from the corridors that policymakers move in. So let's bridge this disconnect, or let's get into this momentum of unmasking or deconstructing some of the current discourse that is built. And thank you all the panelists for making it happen today for us. Thank you so much. Keep safe, keep well, wherever you are. It's been a good conversation.